Account from Private Richard MacLaurence, 12th of January 1843, Hougoumont. Along with a detachment of British and foreign troops which Wellington posted at Hougoumont for its defence was a brigade of English consisting partly of the Light and 7th Companies of the Coldstream Guards. No sooner were the guardsmen fairly within the chateau garden than the tempting ripe cherries drew their attention, and the soldiers were to be seen plucking them off the walls, trees, by the handful, quite regardless of the shot and shells which were increasingly pouring amongst them. "You scoundrels," roared out Major James MacDonald, the officer in command of the brigade. "If I survive this day, I will punish you all." But alas, before the close of the murderous struggle, how few of the cherry stealers were left for the punishment in this world. Out of 134, as smart young soldiers ever drew trigger, the number of 2 companies, only 13 would muster when the roll was called, and these survivors were led out of action by Corporal Smith, every other officer and non-commissioned officer being either killed or wounded. The Emperor's commands carry the post, while our dukes would keep at it, and a most terrible post was to keep. Once the French broke into the courtyard, and such a scene of bayonet work, I, the narrator of this article, never before or since beheld. It was fairly a trial of strength. The French grenadiers were not to be trifled with, and we looked like so many butchers, red with gore, or rather like so many demons rioting against fire. For the shells had set 2 haystacks in a blaze, and many a poor fellow, lying bleeding and wounded, being unable to get out of the way, was burnt to death. "Shut the courtyard gates," roared out our Sergeant Major Fraser, "and keep them out." And a rush was instantly made to the gates, the French without and the guards within. Life and death was in the struggle, for Ney was at hand with a force that threatened destruction to the post. But the English physical strength overcame the French ardor, and the gates were closed by the powerful shoulders of Major MacDonald and the giant of the Sergeant Major, with as many as ours as could get to them. The French, thus enclosed in the courtyard, surrendered by throwing down their firelocks and were ordered to fall back, but they forgot the duties of prisoners. Their countrymen again charged Hougoumont with horse and foot and partly overpowered the Nassau troops and caused them to reel a bit. And then it was that the few Frenchmen we had taken again seized their arms and attacked us from the rear. Fortunately, the post was not carried, and now vengeance stern and dreadful awaited the prisoners. They had grossly violated the articles of war by taking up their arms after surrendering as prisoners, and the consequence was that every man of them was put to death, some by a bayonet and some were thrown into the blazing haystacks by our infuriated men. Though now 27 years have rolled away since that dreadful scene took place, yet it's fresh in my mind's eye, and my ears yet tingle with the yells of these misguided Frenchmen as they were tumbled into the fiery furnace. Change after change, cannonade after cannonade, we repeated on this devoted post, yet still it was not carried. During one of the charges by the French cavalry, I could not but admire the coolness of Highlander belonging to the 92nd Regiment. Donald, by some means, got separated from his regiment and could not get to it before the cuirassiers came up. He therefore came quietly up to our post, coolly saying, "Lads, just FN, will ye a bit? Our regiment is receiving cavalry, I see." As one of the 13 guardsmen who were able to muster being unhurt, I distinctly say that I have been in many a hard-fought action and seen many an arduous struggle. But to hold the post of Hougoumont was by far the most dreadful I have ever witnessed. We might have given it up, for there was scarcely a man, either foreign or English, that was not hurt. But then our Iron Duke's orders were keep the post, and keep it we did, proving that the strictest letter that we knew and could do our duty. Richard MacLaurence, pensioner, formerly Light Company Coldstream Guards, Bockworth Colliery near North Shields. 2nd Battalion, 3rd Foot Guards, from an unknown officer. The defence of Hougoumont was one who was present. The post of Hougoumont was one of considerable strength. It had been occupied on the night of the 17th by various bodies of light troops and the foreign contingent of Nassau, about 800 strong under the command of Colonel MacDonald. Something has been done by art during the night to strengthen the defences, but either from the want of entrenching tools and axes or from some other cause, not a tenth part was done of that which might have been done, and which would have added greatly to the security and certainty of the defence. Not a spadeful of earth was moved, and although the wood in front presented very great facilities, no attempt to form an abattis or oppose any impediment to the rush of an enemy. By the felling of a few trees was made, although this could have been done within 30 yards of the defences of the place. The position itself consisted of the orchard on the left, containing somewhere about 3 acres, surrounding on all the assailable sides by a close, thick and lofty quickset hedge. The stems of the quick were thicker than the arm of a strong man, at least 10 or 12 feet high, and so close that nothing larger than a cat could pass between them. Immediately behind the hedge was a deep ditch, enough to shelter the troops employed, thus offering a natural and secure stockade, stronger than any artificial fortification. The orchard had only one point by which it could be assailed in front, namely the gate leading into the wood. This gate was tolerably well secured and built up. On the British right of the orchard, forming one of its sides and looking into it, stood the citadel and key of the position in the garden house and farm offices of Hougoumont. The whole of this part of the defence was surrounded, on the side next to the enemy and the right flanked by lofty walls, and was perfectly unassailable in front, except by artillery. The troops, being perfectly sheltered, were able to pour their fire in security from the loopholes and windows upon anything advancing in front. This part, including house, garden, farm offices, covered nearly an acre of the ground, and in conjunction with the orchard, formerly an oblong parallelogram presenting a front of somewhere about 200 yards to the enemy. On the French side of the house and garden, coming close to both, was an open but thickly planted wood of about 5 acres. Upon this wood did the successful issue of the defence and real strength of the post entirely depend. For the house and garden, although proof against musketry, could not have stood for 10 minutes against the fire of a few pieces of field artillery, but ill-built must have tumbled down and buried. Its defenders in the ruins, neither could the orchard have been kept for one moment after the fall of and occupation of the house and garden, for although the orchard was very strong, it was entirely commanded, looked into and swept from these points, and was only defensible so long as they remained in the occupation of our troops. But the wood entirely screened the house, garden and offices from the sight and operation of the enemy's artillery, rendering mud cemented walls through which their shot would have passed like brown paper, thus equal for the purpose of defence to the strongest fortification. Owing to the existence of this wood, the troops occupying the house and garden enjoyed a complete exemption from the storm of shot and shells which fell with such fury on the other parts of the position, except an ill-directed shell which occasionally passed over, and now and then a discharge of grape which was lost among the branches of the trees. The attack and defence consisted entirely of musketry. Through this wood, passing close by the officers and right flank of Hougoumont, ran a carriageway to the rear and to the Nivelles road, still farther to the right, where cornfields looking from a considerable elevation into the rear of the house, garden and orchard, with musket range. These fields were occupied during the whole day by the enemy's troops, who were, however, invisible from the chateau itself. It was in this direction that the position was principally threatened during the after part of the day, the access from this quarter being perfectly practicable, few artificial and no natural impediments existing from the house. Along the carriageway above mentioned ran a row of trees and the remains of an old hedge and ditch to the Nivelles road, affording some shelter to the troops who covered and defended the debouche from the wood and the flank of the position. This line was occupied in force about an hour after the commencement of the action by strong detachments of the Fusilier Guards sent down from the heights in the rear.
From the above description, it will be seen that the post of Hougoumont did in reality consist of 3 totally distinct and separate points of defence, that, although all the 3 might be said to be under one command, as acting in mutual support, yet that the officers of each of these points were obliged to act upon their own judgment and responsibility as circumstances arose, and that it was utterly impossible for any one officer to superintend the 3 points of defence at one and the same time. When the action began about 11:30, Colonel MacDonell had occupied the extreme skirt of the wood nearest the enemy, with a larger part of the garrison of Hougoumont. They were attacked in this open position by overwhelming numbers of tirailleurs, supported by heavy masses of infantry, and after a short and gallant struggle, were given the unavoidable confusion down the carriageway to the rear of the chateau and into the houses and offices. Several Frenchmen followed up so closely that they ended along with the troops and were taken prisoners in the courtyard. And it was only by the great personal exertions and courage of Colonel MacDonald himself that the gates were secured and a check given to the pursuit. It was at this moment that the post ran the greatest danger of being carried which it incurred during the day. Not only were the troops, including the whole Nassau contingent, who had been thus placed in advance, driven in, but they were completely dispersed. Of the Nassau contingent, the several foreign battalions, said to have been commanded by Colonel Hepburn, not a man was to be found on the ground after 1 o'clock, with the exception of one officer, who made his appearance about 8 at night. After the action was over, the purpose of asking a certificate of loss of the colours of the corps by fire. This certificate was granted upon his representation of the fact, and no doubt at this moment forms a conspicuous proof and document of the hard services and gallantry of that distinguished body of troops. By whose orders or what object an open and indefensible wood had been occupied so closely to the enemy lines, and why the strong and true point of defence had been abandoned for that which was weak and of no importance, are questions which might be easily asked, but which could not be easily answered. It has always appeared to me that this exposure of the troops in the first instance showed more gallantry and animal courage than military science or judgment, and that the general issue and subsequent more judicious defence covered a great and dangerous mistake rashly made in the beginning, and which might have led to the most fatal results. To reinforce the garrison weakened by all those losses, Colonel Woodford was sent down from the main position with the Coldstream. After dispersing the enemy, he joined Colonel MacDonald in the garden, to which point they henceforth confined their superintendents, and from which neither of them stirred upon the subsequent operations of the day, leaving the defence of the other points entirely to the different officers commanding there. Shortly after the above movement of the Coldstream, 5 or 6 companies of the Fusilier Guards, amounting to about 600 men, were detached from the main position and placed under the command of Colonel Home, with orders to occupy the debouches of the wood, to cover and defend the right flank of the post, and put himself in communication with and report his arrival to the officers in the chateau and garden. After occupying his ground, a sergeant was sent to the house by Colonel Home to report his arrival to Colonels Woodford and MacDonald, and the situation occupied by the Fusiliers commanded by them. The sergeant shortly returned, stating that he had looked everywhere in vain for those officers, and that they were not to be found. Soon after these dispositions had been made, the fire of the enemy considerably increased. Some small stacks of hay or straw also took fire, which produced much smoke, and these circumstances being noticed by the Duke of Wellington, he sent Major Hamilton, aide-de-camp to Sir E. Barnes, with a message and orders to the position. On arriving there, he inquired for the officer in command and was conducted to Colonel Home, with whom the following conversation passed. Major Hamilton: do you command here? Colonel Home: I believe so. I've seen no officers superior to myself. It has been reported to me that Colonels MacDonald and Woodford are not to be found. Major Hamilton: I am directed by the Duke of Wellington to give you the following order. You are to hold the position to the very last, and on no account to give it up or abandon it. Colonel Home, the orders of the Duke shall be obeyed. Major Hamilton then rode away, but shortly after returned and said, "So you, Colonel Home, perfectly understand the full extent of the Duke's orders. He holds the maintaining of this post to be essential to the success of the operation of this day. It must on no account be given up." Colonel Home's answer was, "I perfectly understand the Duke's order. It shall be punctually obeyed. Tell the Duke from me that if the enemy do not attack us much more vigorously than anything I have yet seen, we shall continue to hold our ground without much difficulty." The above message was delivered by Major Hamilton to the Duke, and that a direct relation was established between His Grace and the officer to whom his orders had been delivered, and a great and fearful responsibility was thrown upon the shoulders of the latter. It is quite true in reality, as afterwards appeared, both Colonel MacDonald and Colonel Woodford were in the garden at the time, and that Colonel Home was led into the mistake by the report of a stupid sergeant. The defence was thus successfully conducted on all sides until about 3:30, when the stables having taken fire, the senior officer of the Fusiliers went into the house to give the necessary directions and to remove the wounded officers and men to the rear. This having been accomplished, he proceeded to the garden and there encountered both Colonels MacDonald and Woodford, whom the sergeant had reported as nowhere to be found, and who, as it appeared, had never quitted the spot. The Duke's message was now delivered to them, and on rejoining the Fusiliers in their original position, Colonel Home found himself superseded in his command by Colonel Mercer. Up to this time, Colonel Mercer had been engaged in the defence of the orchard, but having been relieved at that point by Lord Sultan and the light companies of the Grenadier Guards, he had fallen back on the main position, and from thence had been detached with the remaining companies of the 3rd Regiment to join those on the right of Hougoumont. Shortly after the arrival of Colonel Mercer, he was followed by General Hepburn, who came down not because he was ordered to take command, but because not a man remained on the main position whom he could command. Instead of arriving early in the day, it was past 4:00 when he made his first appearance, after the principal attack had been made and failed. From the time of General Hepburn's arrival at Hougoumont until the termination of the battle, no event of importance in reality took place. It has always appeared to me that the merits of this defence have been somewhat overrated. The position, secure from the operation of artillery, at least by the points of attack adopted, was impregnable in the hands of good troops, so long as their ammunition held out. Although much has been said and much written upon the desperate attacks and resistance at this point, I must say that the resistance and the exposure upon the main position itself was fully equal, at least, to anything which I saw in the more sheltered, although apparently more exposed post of Hougoumont, and that the importance of the post itself contributed much to the score of fame as the resistance and gallantry of the troops employed in the defence. Having participated in both, I think myself an impartial as well as competent judge.